afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this BCS Digital Divide Specialist Group monthly series of webinars. My name is Freddie Quek. I'm the chair of the specialist group. Just want to say a few words about the BCS. The BCS is the charter body for IT professionals. Its mission is to make IT good for society. We set up this specialist group about 3 years ago with the intent to make sure that we leave no one behind because of this digital world that we're in. And this monthly series of webinars is a way to help to socialize this issue of digital divide. And not only just about highlighting the problem, but the fact that technology is an enabler, that we can use technology for good. And I welcome the panelists today, Chris, who has been here before, so we'll say a few words. So let me just get the context of this going. Today, the topic is called Closing the Digital Divide, employing qualified vision-impaired professionals. And the reason for this is because currently only 30% of blind and vision-impaired individuals of working age are employed. And we believe that technology presents a powerful opportunity to bridge the digital divide. And therefore, and for employees, especially when you may be unsure, you may have concerns, you may have questions around this issue about how to tap into this segment of the population. We're delighted to have 3 speakers today that has got a lot of expertise in this area, from an employer perspective, from an employee perspective, as well as from a supporter consultant perspective. So I welcome 3 speakers today. I'm going to get each one of them to introduce themselves. First of all, Chris Gibson, you've been here before. So Chris, over to you.
Hi, yes. Yeah, my name's Chris. I work at Southampton Sight, which is a local sight loss charity here in Southampton. We help the visually impaired community in all aspects, whether it's assistive technology, benefits advice, even employment, though we work with other agencies in that regard. I'm also severely sight impaired myself, what used to be known as registered blind. So I've got very much long lived experience in both the working world as a VI and individual, and of course in the real world, so to speak. So hopefully I can give a good perspective on what it is to be both an employer and an employee of the visually impaired.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome. And next, we have Dave Brains, who is a BCS member. So Dave, over to you.
Thank you. Yes. Hello, everyone. So I'm Dave Brains. Excuse me. I'm an employee of a large organization. I work at IBM at the Hursley site, which is a very large site and has been around for a while. I am not visually impaired, but I take an active interest in this and similar things in the workplace. I have some experience of it as an employer. I wouldn't by no means call myself an expert, but I am really keen to learn and share my experiences and make sure that people are supported in the way that works for them, which may be visibly or invisibly. And I'll share with you what I've seen and some thoughts that I have, but I am by no means an expert, either personally or in terms of the amount of times I've encountered this.
Thank you, Dave. And last but not least, Tim, over to you.
Thank you. I'm Tim. I'm a BCS committee member at the Dorset branch. I'm also a PhD student at Bournemouth University. I am registered blind, or severely sight impaired, or blind. And so I've got a lived experience through employment and education now, and how I've adapted using technology, which has empowered me.
Thank you. Now, we do have a number of questions that we want to answer. But before we do that, I was just thinking that maybe a more general sort of question for context setting might be useful. And this is to all of you here, right? Now, can you sort of maybe tell us, the audience, because I myself is, this is a completely alien world to me. Maybe if you can say a few words around what is this context of the vision impaired? Why is this segment of the population important to be aware of them? And why should we be doing something for them? So because you are all passionate about this topic, because either you are part of that, demographics, or if not, you're in that sort of arena to help somebody. So, Chris, maybe can I get you to set a context, because you've been doing this for a long time, you've been helping others. So why is it important? Why does it matter?
I mean, it matters, as you mentioned before, 7 out of 10 working age people who are visually impaired are unemployed. That's a lot of skills that are being left on the table, so to speak. I understand that often employers are reticent to employ people with maybe a disability that they're not quite aware of. They don't know the pitfalls, they don't know how to go about things. But from my experience, sight loss is a spectrum. You can be sight impaired to severely sight impaired. And in that, everybody will usually have some form of sight. Even people who are severely sight impaired, like myself and Tim, 9 times out of 10 will have some residual eyesight. The notion that blind means no sight at all is unfortunately an urban myth. So on that spectrum, I find that people have, ironically, a very different perspective of life. What I've brought to our organization as a visually impaired person, I must say I'm the only visually impaired member of staff here at a sight loss charity, which is in itself quite telling. But I bring the perspective of lived experience. I know what it is to be sight impaired, though I don't know what it is to be completely, as I say, we're all individuals in a sense. But I bring a different perspective on life in general. And I find that with most visually impaired people, because we literally see the world differently, we tend to look at problems, business opportunities, whatever it may well be, from a slightly different perspective to the norm, if you like. And like I said, it's a skill set that I feel is very much underutilized. There's a fear that maybe employing somebody who's visually impaired may be more of an incumbence, if you like, to an employer rather than a benefit. But like I say, in my own experience, I'm passionate because I know what is out there. I know that we are all people. We're people first and foremost, before we are visually impaired. And with the technology that is around today, there is absolutely no reason why you cannot be a productive member of any team, whatever it may well be. As my sight has degenerated over the years, technology has kind of come up to meet me in the middle. It may sound quite ironic, but there's never been a better time to be visually impaired. With the technology that is available, there is no reason why I can't do exactly the same as my colleagues. And in fact, I'm one of only 2 full-time members of staff here. Everybody else is part-time. And that's not because I'm visually impaired. That's because I bring a passion. I bring an enthusiasm. That's another thing I find with the visually impaired. If you're given a chance and an opportunity to show what you're capable of, often we tend to go that little bit further, put 110% in, because to be honest, it's great to be given an opportunity. So yeah, that is why I'm passionate about the VI community and trying to get people out of their homes and back into work where they can be productive and where we can hopefully change society for the good of all people.
Thank you, Chris. Tim, can I get you to say a few words too? And also, I mean, you're blowing my mind away in terms of the fact that you're still also doing your PhD. So
Yeah.
please tell us. It sounds like you can do anything. And what's the background? What's the history? Why is this? Why does this matter?
Yeah. So when I lost my sight, it was a big change for me, but it hasn't actually stopped me. It's changed my direction. But I've been empowered with technology. Studying computing has helped me a lot as well. And I agree with Chris how I bring a different perspective. The challenges I face and solutions I found for them has created me to be probably a better problem thinker than previously. And I've brought new solutions and different solutions to issues. An example is where I've created a program for myself which automatically analyzes my receipts for taxis. It puts it into a form for claiming all automatically for me. And that's where if I was doing it myself, it'd probably take me an hour or 2 hours to do. But I just have it running in the background now. It's a pipeline and it does it all automatically. And that solution has empowered me to focus on other things. things, but other people might not have thought of the challenges dealing with the receipt could have been, and everything. So that's a new solution I brought in myself. Another one I've done is creating a bus sign. When I'm at a bus stop, I've got my route planned. I hold up a bus number. This helps me where if buses see me, they might just go past, or they might stop and ask, but it's not the right bus. So the bus I'm wanting is probably behind and goes round. So having a bus sign, buses slow down, see the sign, see I'm not wanting that number, and they just move on, and I find the correct bus stops for me. Yeah, and it's just having these solutions rather than seeing just problems, I think is very critical from a blind perspective. And I think in the demographic of visually impaired, we have that, and we can bring that into business in a big way.
Thank you. Now, Dave, you and I, we are not, vision impaired, and yet you have such a great interest. So tell me, why is it important? And I know that you are a manager of people with this situation. So tell us from your perspective.
Yeah, so I would absolutely echo that. So I don't have this lived experience, and I absolutely know that therefore I will have a perception of what this is like, but I don't know what this is like. And there is a spectrum, as was mentioned previously. That doesn't mean that people on the lower end of the spectrum don't warrant, equal consideration. So I feel quite strongly about that. But the last point that was made, I would really like to pick up on what you said there, Tim, which is you gave the example of holding a number up for the bus and the rationale behind doing that, and it's a form of communication, and it's a good thing to do. That would not necessarily be obvious to someone who hasn't had that lived experience, especially the reason for doing it and the rationale and so on, rather than the act itself. And this is a really good example, I think, of diversity of viewpoint, which is really valuable to teams. So I work in research. We've done a lot of work with emerging technology. We might have an opinion on what would be a good solution, and we may speak to someone who is living that experience, and they may tell us, actually, that's wrong. What you think the problem is not the problem at all. And I've had a number of examples of this where just in talking with people, that something will be mentioned in passing, and we'll drill into that a little bit. It's like, do you know what? I would never have thought that because I don't experience it. So I'm interested from a diversity of viewpoint perspective, but I'm also interested in terms of supporting people. Different people have different needs. Some people will be quite open. Other people will not want that at all. And we need to listen and respond in a way that works for the individual. Anyway, yeah, I'm not affected. I just would like to understand things like this more so we can work out how to help.
Thank you. And if I may, I'd like to sort of chime in from my perspective too. So now before I was part of this specialist group, this segment of the population is not something that I can relate to. For me, I don't see the grayness of the spectrum of, vision impairments, right? All I see is somebody who can or cannot. That's how I see it. And the worst thing is, as the technology professional, I've been sort of pushing the digital agenda in terms of designing solutions, taking this 80-20 approach, meaning that if we use digital personas, if it's good enough for 80% of the population, it's good enough for 100% of the population. Now I realize that it's not true. And not only that, we need to pay attention to the 20%, but that 20% has to, and this is something that our colleagues from the sort of neurodiverse SG that has advised me. He says, Freddie, we got to understand that there is something called a universal design, meaning that it is for everybody, right? And we all want to be part of that, right? That's fine, and that can be the 80%. But for the 20%, guess what? Regardless of whatever the situation may be, and it doesn't have to be a disability, we got to make sure that that is falling under this bracket of adaptive design, meaning that you adapt to the needs of the population that you're dealing with. So I'm really delighted to be part of this session here, where hopefully I can learn something here. We can all take away something to help us to really understand and do something about addressing this challenge of making sure that we don't put barriers in front of ourselves when we don't need to. Right. And on that note, I'd like to move on to the questions that we have. And many of these questions are relating to barriers, because I think there's a fear, there's a concern. So let's confront them directly and see how we can address them. So the first question is, it sounds like, and Chris, you presented, you joined one of the webinars before. That was the first time that I got a sense of the great solutions out there, but many of them comes at great cost too, right? So for example, what is the sort of cost involved in terms of having the necessary equipment for somebody who's visually impaired to do something? For example, I understand that maybe a sort of the keyboard maybe have to be adapted. So Chris, can I get you to
sure,
speak
by
from
all
that
means.
perspective? Yeah.
I mean, as mentioned, it's on a spectrum. So you will have people who are classed as maybe sight impaired as opposed to severely sight impaired. Everybody will have their own individual needs and their own individual adaptations, if you like. I mean, it's great that you mentioned the word adapt. I think as visually impaired people, particularly if you have a degenerative condition, you tend to adapt as you go along. So we have these life hacks. So as far as equipment is concerned, it really is going to be tailored to the individual. Cost-wise, again, it's going to depend on what kind of kit, what kind of technology the individual might need. And the costs do vary. They are extreme. From one end to the relatively cheap, you might buy an electronic magnifier, for example, for about £100, all the way up to something which may cost £6,000-7,000. Which is what we try to do here at the charity as well. It's not only help people get the funding that they may need for this equipment, but we allow people to try before they buy. Because if you're spending a huge amount of money, you want to at least make sure you're getting the right bit of kit. But most things tend to fall between the two. 6,000-7,000 is the extreme. That's a niche. There's not much out there that costs that much. People may well have heard of something called the Orcam. There's an Orcam Read and the Orcam My Eye Pro. These have been advertised pretty excessively, if you like, over the last few years. They are quite expensive. So, for example, the Orcam Read is £1,800 to £2,500, and the Orcam My Eye Pro is around £3,500. They are an amazing piece of kit, but they're not something you would just buy on a whim. You really need to give them a good try before you buy. But yes, as far as costs are concerned, they can be. We are seen as a niche market, if you like, because it's not a mass market. A lot of companies, quite rightly, they have to develop these things specifically, and they cannot get that back by mass production. So things do tend to cost that little bit more. I mentioned electronic magnifiers, a little handheld one, like I say, around 100, 110, but they can go up to £700, £800, £900. Or you can get the bigger ones, what they used to call a CCTV reader, but that's like a TV size that you put the book underneath. Those can be 2,000, or if it has text-to-speech software incorporated into it, that might bump it up by another 1,000. But what you should really bear in mind is that, particularly for employers, a lot of these costs can be offset. I think Tim is going to talk about his experience of access to work, so I'm not going to tread on his toes, so to speak. But a lot of this technology can be gotten through access to work, through government programs, through charitable organizations. That may take a bit longer than going through access to work. But for example, I work here at Southampton site. I'm severely sight impaired. I do have an Orcam. I use text-to-speech software, which is called JAWS, which a lot of people use if they're visually impaired, which basically does what it says on the tin. Anything on the screen that my mouse hovers over, it will read it out to me. Whatever I type, it will read it out to me. These adaptations are pretty much all I needed from the off, and they were all provided for by Access to Work. My business, I say business, my charity that I work for didn't have to fund my equipment at all. And that's across the board. And that's not just for people with sight loss. You can have mental health issues. Access to Work covers a variety of impairments. But as far as sight impairment is concerned, I guess the main thing to focus on is it's going to come down to individuals. No two sight impaired individuals are the same. No two needs are the same. Some may need a few hundred, some may need a few thousand, but there are ways and means to get this without it having to impede upon the employer, or without it having to impact whether or not they should or shouldn't employ somebody. And from my own experience, getting on with the job with that kind of equipment, I was up and running very quickly. I was doing more than what I was employed to do very quickly, which is why I'm now currently full-time, because I started only working 2 days a week. It was a risk, even for a sight loss charity, to take on board somebody with a visual impairment, not because of my capabilities, but because of society's assumptions of my capabilities. That, to me, is the bigger barrier. The technology is there, the funding is there, the access is there. All it really needs is somebody to take a leap of faith to really, get the best out of their employees. And that is, thankfully for me, what my employer has done. And like I say, now I'm full-time and I'm never been happier.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, Tim, do you want to come in and tell us a bit about this access to work funding, or how you managed to, from your personal experience, how
Yes.
how it's helped you?
Yes, so access to work, look, I applied for that once I lost my sight, and they came in, did an assessment on me to assess my own personal needs. So they put in or funded some of the costs, not all of it, because I was already working there. I've been there for a while, and the company had to pay 80% of the cost, so not 100%. No, access to work paid 80% of the cost, and the company paid 20% of the cost. So it came through. It took a while. It took actually probably about 4 or 5 months to come through before I could get back into work. So it did take some time. However, there is a slightly different process if you're starting a new job. If you've got your start date, you can start applying 6 weeks before or within 6 weeks of starting, and they will pay 100%, no matter the size of the company, the cost of the equipment once they've done the assessment. However, if you do it after the 6 weeks of starting employment, small companies, they have to pay an initial, they don't pay anything. Medium-sized company, which starts at around 50 to 249 employees, they would pay like a £500 advance, and then just 20% of the cost up to £10,000. And then for a large company, there's £1,000 initial payment, and then the 20% cost or anything over that. And there is a limit cap to access to work, which is around 69,000. That really does pretty much cover a lot of things. That covers things for like transport, equipment, and training. They can cover some training. They can also cover up to 20% of assistance for the role, which I think is really good. For me, for doing my work at university, I've been able to be granted through another scheme, student disability allowance, access to remote support. So even though they don't need to be with me, they can access and support me remotely as well. So there's a lot of range they can support in different ways and aspects to help the individual. And the grant also supports a business for employment.
Wow, I mean, it doesn't sound that prohibitive for an employer, right? We're not talking about so much that is impossible.
No.
This is good to know. And Dave, what about you from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think I'll be a little bit shorter because I will only talk about what I've directly experienced. So we said before there's a spectrum. So in this particular case, the costs were pretty much zero. We funded a webcam because the position was more convenient. And there are certain other things like attending physical meetings via a virtual connection because it gives you the screen and the ability to get closer and so on. But I would say it's actually been very straightforward and unintrusive, and cost-wise, yeah, I've not directly experienced anything at the more expensive end of the scale, but from what I've had described, it sounds very well supported, and I think the more people know that, the better.
Yeah. Okay, good to know. So we know that cost may not be a big barrier. That's good to know. Now let's talk about some of the physical requirements for a vision impaired individual, right? What else needs to be done for them to enable them to be able to do their job? So maybe, Tim, I can get you to start from your perspective. What extra equipment do you need to have? What else do you need to do just to be able to do your job?
So whether for me to do my job, it's really the screen reader. I use a Braille display, and then I have noise cancelling headphones. And then one other thing would be my mobile, which has quite a few different apps on it as well. And then just a dictaphone as well, to make audio notes. So there's very little technology, even though there's a lot of software I use, and a lot of that is AI based now, especially for mathematical equations, and using software like Equatio. For physical adjustments, there isn't really any I need. The only thing I would say I have needed is knowing my routes to places. So having a guide initially to help me. Once I know my routes, know how safe they are, I'm perfectly fine on my own. I am a long cane user, so I think that's for physical. The only other one thing I can think of actually would be a fire evacuation plan. I have a personalized one for myself. So if I'm upstairs, I know where the safe spaces to go if the fire alarms go, so I don't have to go downstairs or anything. So I know where they are. So there's no real, for me anyway, any physical adaptations to buildings or anything.
Okay, good. Chris, what about you?
Yes, pretty much the same. I mean, there is an emphasis on what they call reasonable adjustments when you get a job. So the employer is expected to make reasonable adjustments, not just for somebody with visual impairment, but for anybody with any kind of impairment. But that can be quite a scary term. But that is a negotiation between the employee and the employer as much as anything else. There's no real hard and fast rules in place. There are some guidelines, but nothing major. From my perspective, similar to Tim, all I needed was the time to orientate myself. Once I know the building, once I know my way around, as long as things are kept clear for me and my fellow staff, they're obviously very aware, and we're aware as a sight loss charity anyway, so things tend to stay as they are. So I've learned where everything is in the building. I like Tim, I've been shown the routes from where I live to my work. Beyond that, there's not been any actual building requirements. There's been no money that's had to be spent. There's no extra lighting. There's been nothing along those lines. Again, we are a sight loss charity, so our building is made accessible regardless, but it's no more so than any other public building. So cost-wise, yeah, I haven't, there's been nothing that the charities had to do for my particular situation. I don't want to keep reiterating the spectrum, but it is, again, it's going to come down to individuals. Maybe some other people would, but in my experience with a visual impairment, it's not like somebody in a wheelchair that may well need doors widening or access up and down stairs, for example. When it's visually impairment, most people are mobile unless they have other impairments separate to the visual impairment. And once they learn their routes around the building, they're more than capable of getting around on their own. Going back to access to work, I do have a support worker with me, mind you, and he's with me pretty much full time. He's paid for through access to work, and he's basically my eyes when I need them. So if I'm out and about, I do home visits. Unfamiliar areas is a different kettle of fish. I know where I am in a familiar place, but when I'm going out off-site, so to speak, I don't know where I'm going or where I am. So he's there basically to drive me to appointments and to help me safely in and out of appointments as well. So again, he is a separate employee. He's not technically employed by Southampton site. He's technically employed by me in that sense. And he would do those things that I simply can't do, or it's simply easier for him to do for me, which is not as much as you might think as well. With text-to-speech software and the like, I'm pretty capable of doing 99% of the job, but it's always good to have that person in the background. But yeah, adaptation wise, I don't need a different desk. I do have a larger monitor. I can't remember what they call it, but the longer version, so to speak, ultra wide. That's the one. Ultra wide monitor, purely because if I enlarge things on the screen, sometimes half of the Word document or whatever would cut off if it was a regular sized monitor. That again was supplied by Access to Work, but that's very specific to my needs. It might not be specific to the next person's needs. Ultimately, I would say most people with visual impairments don't need many adaptations, and those they do need can easily be provided for by Access to Work.
Okay. And Dave, from your perspective as a software manager, and also your background as a technologist, I know this question is around the physical part. Maybe you can also touch a bit about how we use technology, from either software or hardware perspective to help. Yeah. So over to you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the other perspective that is perhaps a little different here is that we are a small team on a large site. So we have local things that are within our control. So for example, a particular individual may want a dedicated office because maybe they have to speak and listen a lot, or maybe that's okay with headphones. It will vary by the individual. Being able to control ambient light, for example, but actually maybe they would prefer to share an office or work in open plan. So within the things that are within our control, we would absolutely do that. But we are a small part of a much bigger site. So there are things that are not within our control. But the relationship between the team and the bigger site is very good. And all of this would absolutely fall into the reasonable adjustments category of, what is the need? Are there any issues? And if so, how might we resolve those or seek an alternative? So this is all good. You mentioned about technology as well. So one thing that we've done over many years, I joined this team in 2006, and we've had a number of projects where we've looked at different aspects, different considerations, but some of them we had, for example, in the early days, an avatar-based signing avatar. This was obviously for people with hearing issues. We had some assumptions about how people would use this. We didn't initially have access to anybody. This was just something we perceived. It was very interesting when we actually started to interact with people. So technology can be good. A point was made earlier that sometimes for highly specialized technology, costs can be high because the market is not great. But also I think it's not quite arrogance, but there's some word that is assuming you know what is needed. You really need to engage with people to find out what they need and recognize that actually just because you talk to one person doesn't mean everybody will need it. Trying to think of other examples of what we've done. We did some good work with one of the rail providers about pre-booking, things like ramps and so on. So this is for physically disabled people. And actually, a big part of it was confidence that things were in place rather than actual issues occurring. So it's technology can help, but also you can sometimes do your best will, but actually not quite do the right thing. So you've got to be able to be flexible as well.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we've sort of, some of you have mentioned this, but it's worth just asking the question, right? You mentioned that, physically, from your own personal perspective, each one of us may have specific needs. That's one thing. But what about from an employer perspective in terms of the physical building modifications? For example, some of us who may have relatives or friends who has some issues, and therefore we have to look into adapting the house to be a bit different for easier access and whatnot. So maybe can we say a few words around, I know it's again going to be a spectrum, but just give some indication about, the small things that you do versus the big things that you have to do. Yeah. So Chris, do you want to kick us off in terms of?
Yeah, sure. I can. Probably a good way is to describe what we've done here in our center.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my mantras is high contrast. So when you're visually impaired, for me personally anyway, seeing the difference between, say, a wall and a floor can sometimes be difficult. There's different issues with depth perception, but color as well. So what we've done here is if we have a dark door, for example, we have a different lighter colored handle. Now, that sounds incredibly simple, and it is, but it makes all the difference. We have blue doors here with white handles. It stands out to me. So I know there's a door and I can see where the handle is. If the two are the same color, I can't find the handle. It's a very small, simple thing. Similarly, between the wall and the floor, all you have to do is put a white line across or I say a white line, something that contrasts with the color of the floor. Again, it's just to give an indication of where surfaces may differ. And these are very easy adaptations to make. We get a bit frustrated because when new buildings are built or new hospitals are built and these kind of things, these adaptations aren't put in place from the off, because they don't cost anything to do. It's just doing it in the first place, if that makes sense. So yeah, high contrast, borders along walls and floors, for example, lighting, depending on the situation. And of course, if there are steps, it's always good to have highlighting on each step, but it's pretty marginal. And a lot of these things are common sense and things that are already in place in public areas. They just need to be adopted by employers to make their buildings safer. And a good point that I always think, it's not just about people who are visually impaired. We have an aging population. Most people's sight does deteriorate. It may not deteriorate to the extent of myself and Tim, but it does deteriorate over time. We tend to live in a world planned and created by the young people in their 20s and 30s who feel they're never going to get old. But the reality is people are working longer than they ever had. So these tiny adaptations don't just benefit somebody like me who uses a long cane and might need a little bit more time to orientate themselves. They might help, you know, a third of your workforce who maybe are over the age of 60, their sight has maybe degenerated just a little bit, you know, they might need reading glasses, that kind of thing. Having high contrast, having adequate lighting, having highlighting on stairs, simple things that any building, you know, any employer can adapt into their building. And it doesn't just help the minority. And I say minority in quotes in a sense, because there are at least 2 million people who are classed as sight impaired in this country at any given moment. And that's the ones who are certified with a sight impairment. Who knows how many millions more have got sight issues but aren't actually certifiable. But yeah, those other adaptations don't just help the sight impaired, they help everybody.
Thank you. Tim, what about you?
Yeah, I agree with Chris. For me, I had a journey into my sight loss. So there was a lot of different things I started doing at different times. My initial one was taking photos of things. Instead of writing things down, I took photos. Then I started losing more of my sight. I started having a range of different colored plates. So a dark plate or bowls for lighter foods like lasagna or ice cream. And then I had white bowls for darker foods, like sausages and everything. So the contrast I needed at the beginning. Once I started losing the color, I then needed things a bit more bigger. When I started losing my central and peripheral, I had patchy vision. So I used word runners, especially on the Kindle books. So it just shows you a word at a time. I could hold that in one place, in one aspect I could see, and read a book still. So it was running through the words. And it's all just these little adaptations you do as you go along. And some of them were just real cheap, like bump-on stickers on the microwave, changing my cooking style from weighing things to volume. So baking a cake, I use cups. That's for volume measurement. And so there's a lot of little adaptations you can do constantly. And yeah, and that's why I think it makes it so unique to the person. You find your way through what works for you.
Thank you. And Dave, any sort of
Yeah,
comments?
so I would say it's really great to reflect on the fact that you could look up like the best guidance from the government about how to design your space, or, well, you should do that, or you could talk to people and you could find that a high contrast line between the floor and the wall is a really good thing to do. And actually, it's not at all expensive. You do that. You might, you know, so it's absolutely a question, I think, of listening and maybe hearing some things that you wouldn't have yourself realized, but are actually very actionable.
Okay, thank you. Now we've talked about barriers. What I'd like to do as we sort of start to wrap up this session, let's focus on the possibilities. Let's focus on the opportunities, right? Let's focus on, because we started the conversation by talking about why it's useful, why does it matter, right? So can we, let's say, maybe get each one of you to talk about, the opportunities or the kinds of opportunities that we should be sort of creating to enable more visually impaired people to join the workforce. Okay. Chris, can I get you to, give us some ideas, suggestions, or things that you've done to just help to educate and encourage others to do this too?
I mean, part of my role here is to do sight loss awareness training. So I will go into businesses and I will talk about my own life story. As Tim mentioned, I'll talk about my life hacks along the way. I basically try to demystify what it is to be visually impaired. There are a lot of assumptions and a lot of people are kind of fearful for you in a sense. So you can almost be overly protected and overly sheltered by those around you as if you're made out of glass or something. So I will go in and I will talk about sight loss, what it is, but then I will also get people to wear blindfolds or what we call semi-specs, which replicate different eye conditions, and I just get them to do a bit of sighted guidance. It's remarkable. It only takes about an hour. It's not a whole day thing, but it's remarkable how much just talking to people and letting them experience what you experience demystifies, but also humanizes. Often I walk in, I'm a strange man with a white cane, but by the time I leave, I'm just Chris. People begin to see the person rather than the disability. And I think that's something that, again, employing people who are visually impaired benefits a company. You get such a wealth of diversity, such different voices. It's a great thing these days that difference is so celebrated and put up, rightly so, on a pedestal for what it is. It's different experiences, and different experiences feed into businesses. They feed into conversations. I've never expected the world to change for me because I have a visual impairment, but it's nice to have a voice at the table. It's nice to be heard. And I think that's all anybody with a visual impairment wants, is to be seen for what they are. They're an individual like anybody else. They have their own individual skills, their own individual voice. But if we really want to push the boundaries of technology and the boundaries of society in general, we really need to strive for diversity. What you're saying about 80% is good enough, but that 20%, if you felt that you're left out, if you felt like you're on the margins, if this technology that comes along, which is supposed to make us all feel fantastic and wonderful and benefit society as a whole, if you're leaving out even 20% of the population, you're isolating them further. 7 out of 10 working age don't work. That needs to change, not because they need to work necessarily in any and all jobs, but because they give a different perspective. I can't stress it enough. There are things, as Dave has said, about technology, smartphones, apps, these kind of things. I've come across apps which have been aimed at the visually impaired, and I can tell you they've never been designed by somebody who's visually impaired, because ironically they're unusable. You have to communicate with certain communities to get the best out of everybody. And the fact that me and Tim, we have these life hacks, we have these problem-solving brains, we have an awful lot to offer society as a whole. But I find when I go into businesses and I talk about my own situation and they get to walk a mile in my shoes, so to speak, it does help break down that mystique that surrounds any kind of impairment. And people, again, I do feel warm to you and realize that you do actually have something to offer as a visually impaired person, but not necessarily purely because you're visually impaired.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, so I'll take it in a different aspect. For companies, there is a charter by the government, the Disability Confidence Charter, and that's companies saying they're committed to improving. There's companies who are employing disabled people, and there are companies leading the way to help disabled people get into have equal opportunities to get into work. So there are some aspects where the government is doing soft legislation to help disabled people into work. However, there's still a huge barrier, especially for visually impaired. Unemployment rates or employment rates for disability in general is around 50%, where for the general population it's around 75%. But for visually impaired and blind, it's a lot lower, to where it's like 1 in 4 employed for visually impaired and blind people. But for just blind, with like 90% loss or more, it's around 1 in 10 who are employed. But there are some avenues for them to get into work. I've met, because when I started off losing my sight and becoming unemployed, I looked into 2 options. One was fitness and one was technology and computing. The fitness people, they were quite often self-employed and had a few customers, but found trouble getting work in gyms. Where for computing, what people I met, not only did they have trouble getting into work, what they did find though, they could go self-employed. And as self-employed, they found they had a lot more work than they could even do. So they found that much more beneficial. So even for myself now, well, before I lost my sight, I worked heavily, did management, had a big background in running, where I ran ultra marathons, and I developed my skills, doing my PhD and everything. I feel really confident in being self-employed rather than being employed by a company now. And I think some visually impaired people see that as more of an option nowadays, being self-employed rather than being employed. But that companies are losing out on, like Chris says, someone with problem-solving skills and a different perspective. Yeah. So I think employers are losing a lot more than disabled people or visually impaired at the moment.
Thank you. And Dave, what about you?
So interestingly, when you asked the question, that last point was exactly what I was going to make. So obviously I am in a job in an industry, but my job involves working with knowledge workers, experts, professionals who know programming languages, they know research areas. The experiences I've had with visually impaired people and other people with similar disruptions, if you like, to their working life, they are excellent. They are, I think it was said earlier, there's something about delivering 110%. These are exceptional professionals who excel at their job, and if actually you interact with them online via change requests or, code updates, which is the kind of world I'm in, you just see an excellent professional delivering. And I think that we've talked a lot about the value of diversity and diverse opinions and so on. This is really important, but I think there's also a level of, the individuals are just very good at what they do. That may well, and I'm sure it will, vary into other domains you mentioned, like, for example, health and fitness and physical gym environments and so on. I can't talk to that because that's not my world, but the world I'm in of knowledge workers and experts, there's just a level of experience which is just a valuable addition to the team, regardless of everything else.
Okay. Now I have one final question, but before I do that, I just want to check whether our attendees has got any questions or comments. If you do, please come in or put in the chat. Please do. Okay. I will give you some time. The final question I'd like everybody the panelists to talk about is, if there's one thing that we all can do, so this is your advice to all of us outside this domain that may not be our area of expertise. What would be the one thing that you would like us to know or do something about? So Chris, maybe if I can get you to say something about that first.
On the spot, one thing. I guess, for fear of repeating myself, but it's to try and see the person rather than the disability. Whatever the reason, sight loss has a very negative connotation in society. I think sight is a very immediate thing. Most people associate what they see with who they are, and the thought of losing their sight seems to be a terrifying prospect for them. And I can relate to that to a point, but this is all I've ever known. You know, my life is my life. My sight loss is one aspect of that life, but it does not define who I am as a person. All I ask is that people give anybody with any kind of impairment, whatever it is, whether it's neurodiversity, sight loss, hearing impairment, whatever it may well be, just give them the same time and energy that you would anybody else. And I think you will be surprised at what they have to offer and how capable they are. I mean, again, going back to adaptations and the like, me and Tim, and I'm sure many other people with any kind of impairments, we have these life hacks. These give us an edge, if you like. It's not just about problem solving, it's about determination. You know, Tim's doing his PhD, for example. You know, I got a first-class degree at university and Student of the Year award, and at the time nobody even knew I had a sight impairment. It's this determination, not to prove ourselves. I'm not saying it comes from a negative feeling of lower self-esteem, but I do think you need a bit more commitment if you have a sight impairment. You need that energy and that motivation. So perhaps we have a slighter edge than the average because we have to work that little bit harder in the first place to keep up with our peers. But yeah, my one thing is try to see us as people rather than just disabilities.
Thank you. Tim.
Yeah, so I would make a point, especially for like computing companies, is when they think about computer programming, they seem to think computer programming is code on a screen or a class diagram. What they tend to forget is it's a mental model. And visually impaired people, we have good working memories, let's say, so that we can create these mental models just as well, or even to a better standard than visually impaired person. A second point I would like to make is humans are quite bad at designing things for other humans. And we fall into the bracket of we keep things the same. We don't like changing things. And we see that with like the QWERTY keyboard that was created with typewriters, or lighting, the buttons, they don't map well to which light turns on. Having someone with a different perspective can bring in a wider range of new ideas, be more innovative, and that's what visually impaired people can bring.
Thank you. And Dave?
Yeah, so as someone who doesn't live this experience, but I have learned a few things along the way about this, and other related things is assumptions. Don't make assumptions, but both in terms of what would work well for people and indeed what people want, because there's a fine line between not asking at all and therefore maybe someone being shy and them not asking, but also not assuming that, you know, there's one solution that worked for the last person, so it's going to work for this person. So I see that, you know, both in terms of every day, but also in terms of when you are thinking about a product or a solution or some bit of research that you have an opinion on. Absolutely go and talk to multiple people. Doesn't matter what it is. You need to get their lived perspective on this.
Thank you. Look, we have a question from Paul, and the question is, what can help develop a problem-solving mindset for job hunters? Anyone?
I would say challenging yourself. So find challenges to push yourself and have a growth mindset, that learning new skills and driving your own knowledge forward.
Okay. Anyone else?
Stay curious. You know, I think what Tim said earlier was very true about visualization. I think we both visualize the world as much as we see it, and it gives you a strong sense of the abstract, if you like. But it also makes me curious about what I can't see. So in a way, I envision what I can't see in my own very unique way. So if you talk about problem solving, whether it's job hunting or not, it gives you a certain perspective. But as far as if you are visually impaired, or if you're somebody who's trying to employ people who are visually impaired, all I would say is, like I say, give people a chance. Just let them try. You know, what have you got to lose in a sense? You might well find that diamond in the rough who has the solution to life, the universe, and everything.
Thank you. And Dave, you have any final
Yeah,
comments here?
so I can't answer that question, but I can tell you that when I'm interviewing potential employees, obviously there's a level of knowledge that you need. Whatever the job is, there is a level of knowledge you need. Assuming you've got that, I prefer someone who will explain their thinking and say, I don't know, and actually transparently kind of describe how they're trying to answer a question. Just appearing to know everything is not enough. So it's not quite answering the question, but I think a problem-solving mindset is actually more valuable than knowing all the answers, because it means that tomorrow you're going to have a different problem, right? So how do you go about solving that? And I'm talking specifically about the knowledge engineering, knowledge expert environment here, where, you know, we're doing research, we're doing development, so every day is different.
Okay. Right. Look, we have now reached the end of the time that we have for this session. I just want to make a couple of comments. The first one is relating to what Chris you did in the previous webinar, where it was my first exposure to this domain. And one thing I remember you said was that somebody who has the visual impairment, that is where the opportunity is even greater in terms of how technology can help them. So that's something that I remember and I took away. And this session here, I took away one from Tim about the fact that you don't have to see coding as just coding on the screen. It's about how the mental model is in the head, and visually impaired people do have that capacity that maybe the normal person may not have as much of in abundance. So those are the takeaways from my perspective. So that's my point number one. Point number two is I just want to thank you all for coming to this session and giving our audience a chance here. This session will be put on the website too, so that everybody, those who are not here today, will be able to look at this. And I really would like to make sure that we continue to do what we can to educate the world around us, educate the people around us in terms of making sure that we don't leave anyone behind. So on that note, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Tim. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
And thank
you.
you those who joined us today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.